Okay, and if you have to access it from here, you can go to class, go to oop such class, and then we will try to access the files that we are creating it here. Okay, so let's save this file. I'm saying Control S. I pressed Control S here, so it will ask me where to save the file. So I'll save it in the amps folder, www oop and class. Okay, and I'm gonna call it as car.php. okay, and I'm gonna paste some of the notes that I want you to remember. So here's the notes. Let's go through one by one, then we'll start creating a class. Okay, the first thing that you have to remember is the class name. Okay, when you write a class, the first letter should always start with capital letters. Well, it's a naming convention that is good to follow, and your first letter should always starts with capital letter. So if you're writing car, database, file, video, the first letter should be always capital letter. The file name should match with class name, which is easy to follow. So if you see the file here, car.php, definitely you see there's a caps here, so you might be make a first guesses, maybe a car class is inside this file. It's also a very good notation when you write a file, the file name should match with the class name. And always remember, one file should have one class. It's not a mandatory requirement. You can have multiple classes in one file. Just for the good practice, right, you should have one file in one class. You can have multiple classes in one file as well. Okay, and then there's a class is a keyword that is used to define a class. What is a class? Class is a specification of an object. So when you're thinking of an object of car, you have to first define it. What is your class? Which is nothing but the specification, right? Class is open and close with the flower brackets like this, and all the methods and properties like variables and functions you have to define inside the class. Okay, so let's define the class first. So the keyword to start defining the class is called as class, and then the name of the class name. The name of the class name should match the file name. The file name is car.php and the class name is car. Okay, we'll not add .php here, we just say it's a class car. Okay, now you can have functions and variables inside this. There's nothing fancy about writing functions. If you know how to write a function, you can just write a function like this. Okay, and then you can write your echo statements here. You can say hello from car class, and you'll add an end of line. Okay, so that's how you define a car class. Okay, you have a car name of a class, and basically it's matching with the file name, and you have a function called hello class which is printing some value. Okay, so let's execute this and see what happens. Okay, so I'm going to open a command line, then I'm going to navigate to this folder and make sure you have PHP installed, right? I'm using PHP 7, and if it's installed then you should be able to execute the PHP file. So I'll say php car.php. okay, and there's no output here, right? Obviously we haven't called the function, so there will not be any output here, but just to remember that class is a specification. Okay, class, anything that you write here will not be executed. Okay, you have to create an object of it to execute it. We haven't discussed about how to create an object, but I want you to remember that class basically won't give you an output, and you don't write echo statements outside the functions. You don't write like this. Okay, this is a wrong way of writing a class. You don't write echo statements outside the functions. The only thing that you have inside a class are two things. One is a variable, another is a function. Okay, anything else apart from it will error it out. Okay, don't write anything outside the functions. Everything that you write, you want to write an echo statement, you want to do some calculation, do always inside a function. So class can have two things. One is a variable, one is a function. Okay, so this is how you define a car class. Okay, so let's look at how do you define a database class. I'm not gonna jump into topics because we haven't discussed what is an object and how to define an object. So when we go into that lecture, when we understand what is object, how to define an object from a class, then we will start to enhance this program and then try to use the object to call this function. Okay, but for now let's keep the discussion only to classes, because that's what we have seen so far, and then we will start creating another class just to understand how to define a class. Okay, so I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to call it database.php. and if you look at the naming convention that I'm trying to use it here, you'll pretty much understand how you have to also start using this naming convention to write a class. Now I'm defining a class database, and you can see the first letter is D and the file name and class name matches with the same name. Okay, and you have to start thinking in objects and start organizing your code into databases. So in class you can define two things, one is variable and one is function. So for database, what could be the variables? To define a variable, you have to mention public, and then you will say DB connection. One variable you require, maybe you require a string to hold the maybe a records. Okay, so this is the way how you define a variable. Okay, we're going to talk about what is this public keyword, and you have private and protected. We're going to discuss about all those things, but as of now when you define a variable, just mention public it here. Okay, so this is how you define a variable. Then we'll define some functions. What could be the functions that you can have in a database? Just think for a second, if you have to write a class for a database, what could be the functions that you could have? Okay, to save time, I'm going to copy paste some of the functions. Well, there could be function where you can open the connection to the database. There could be function to fetch a record which accepts an ID, and based on that ID that record is fetched. Maybe you have a method that is called as insert records, that is you pass the data and that data is been inserted into the database. And you have an update records where you just pass in the ID and then you update that record. Then you have delete records where you can pass the ID and delete the records. Maybe you can just say, okay, for this ID, this is the new data, right? You can even say that. So this is basically how you are organizing your code in classes. Okay, I'm not going details of how and what are the concepts, how to define connecting to a database, but take a step back. Okay, forget about the implementation, but think in objects. Think in how you're going to organize your code into classes. So what we have done is we have defined a database class. We have defined a variable that is useful for that database to operate, and we have defined methods that's basically work as an operation on that specific databases. Okay, and you see we haven't combined car and database into one class. We could say car database, and then we could just combine all the methods, database, variables and functions into one. This is the concept of OOP, where you can think, you're thinking in object. Database is one object, so all the variables and functions to that database in one class. For car, there is one method, so you're defining that method specific to that class. Okay, so class is a keyword that is used to define a class, and once you define a class and when you run this program, it doesn't print anything. Obviously, even though you have these functions and you have echo statements, your class cannot be called by itself. You need an object to call that function, because class is just a specification of an object. You have to create an object of a class to call that methods. As of now, you should know how to create a class and what are the rules of the class that we have seen, right? You have to understand what are the naming conventions and good practice to create a class. Okay, this should be enough for you to understand how to write and define a class. Okay, so let's run the database as well. Okay, there's no output because anyway we are not printing anything and we are not creating an object to call the class. Okay, so this is how you create a class with some variables and with some functions. Okay, so that's all for this lecture on how to define a class, and I'll see you in the next one.